Why was everyone in that briefing room looking past her, as if she didn't exist at all? Commander Evelyn Reed stood at parade rest in the Joint Operations Center, her eyes fixed on something no one else seemed to see. The holographic maps above the central platform shimmered with sapphire and emerald light, casting ghostly shadows across the faces of assembled officers. But Reed wasn't watching them. She was watching a whisper, a signal, something so faint that most would call it nothing. Most would call it noise. The air in that room was cold and pressurized, humming with the low-frequency static of a dozen servers processing intelligence from half a world away. Reed's focus was absolute. It was the kind of silence that comes from 2 decades of service, the kind of stillness that people often mistake for absence. She tracked the ghost signature of a submersible drone across the tactical overlay, watching its latency pattern pulse against the background noise of commercial shipping traffic. Her breathing was steady, her mind was clear, and then he walked in. Brigadier General Marcus Thorne, a man carved from broad assumptions and loud victories. His dress uniform strained slightly at the shoulders as he strode onto the platform, moving with the proprietary confidence of someone who believed his rank was an extension of his physical presence. His eyes, accustomed to scanning horizons for conventional threats, slid past Reed as if she were part of the room's architecture. Just another fixture, another object that didn't require acknowledgement. "Report," he barked, his voice a gravelly announcement aimed at the entire room but directed toward Admiral Vance, who sat silently in his command chair, watching. A junior lieutenant began the briefing, his voice tight with the nervousness of speaking to senior leadership. "Sir, we are tracking anomalous electronic warfare signatures emanating from Grid Square 79er. The pattern suggests a polymorphic frequency hopping array, possibly land-based." Thorne scoffed. It was a sound like grinding stone, dismissive and curt. "Polymorphic. Son, that's ghosting from the commercial channels. I've seen it 100 times, it's noise. Get me a real target." The room absorbed his confidence like it always did. When a general speaks with that much certainty, rooms tend to believe him. But Commander Reed did not move. She stood there at parade rest, still composed, and when her voice came, it cut through the hum of the servers with the weight of absolute certainty. "General, with respect, the latency between hops is too consistent for commercial reflection. The periodicity is machine-driven. It is not noise. It is a targeting system preparing a firing solution." The room fell silent. The holographic display seemed to freeze mid-shimmer. Thorne's head swiveled slowly, his eyes finally landing on Reed. He saw a woman of medium height, dark hair pulled back in a severe regulation bun. He saw the silver oak leaf of a commander on her collar, but his mind registered it as an administrative detail, not a mark of command authority. He saw her stillness not as discipline but as timidity, something to be corrected, something to be put in its place. He walked toward her, his boots loud on the polished floor, each step deliberate, each step a performance for the room that was watching. He picked up a glass of ice water from the briefing table, condensation already beating on its surface. "Commander," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "in my Marine Corps we don't chase shadows. We identify tangible threats. We put steel on target. We don't get distracted by static." He gestured with the glass, water sloshing over the rim. Reed's expression remained unchanged. She met his gaze directly. "The threat is tangible, General. The signal is the precursor, it's the whisper before the scream." Thorne's face tightened. He saw her refusal to be cowed as a direct challenge to his authority in front of his men and the Admiral's staff. He needed to reassert dominance. In his world, that required a spectacle. "Let me cool you down, Commander," he said, his voice a low sneer. "You seem a little overheated." With a deliberate, almost theatrical motion, he inverted the glass. Ice-cold water cascaded over her head, soaking the collar of her Navy working uniform, dripping from her chin onto the pristine floor. The ice cubes clattered at her feet. A few junior officers gasped. Others looked away, their faces a mixture of shock and embarrassment. Admiral Vance's jaw set like granite, but he remained silent, observing. Commander Evelyn Reed did not flinch. She did not wipe the water from her face. She simply stood there, water dripping from her eyelashes, her posture unbroken. The only change was the slight narrowing of her eyes, a shift from passive observation to active recording. She was documenting the breach of protocol, the assault, the public humiliation. Her mind cataloged the witnesses, the time on the chronometer, the exact words spoken. She was a censor, and the data was now stored. Thorne smirked, placing the empty glass back on the table with a loud click. There, clarity. He turned his back on her, addressing the room again. Now let's get back to finding something that actually bleeds. Reed remained at her post for another 30 seconds, her presence a silent, dripping rebuke to the general's performance. Then, without a word, she executed a precise about-face and walked out of the Joint Operations Center. The wet slap of her boots on the floor was the only sound that followed her. She walked the length of the corridor, the chilled fabric of her uniform clinging to her skin. She ignored the averted gazes and the hurried whispers that followed in her wake. Because here's what most people don't understand about humiliation. It requires acceptance. It requires you to internalize the judgment of others, to let their perception become your reality. Reed had learned long ago that emotion was a luxury, a corrupting variable in a complex equation. Anger was noise. Humiliation was a subjective interpretation. The events in the operations center were simply data points, an unprofessional act, a failure of leadership, a violation of the uniform code of military justice. The problem required a solution, not a reaction. Her destination was a small, secure communications annex tucked away behind the main server farm. The air here was even colder, smelling of ozone and clean electricity. She sat at a hardened terminal, one reserved for sensitive compartmented information. Her fingers, still damp, moved across the keyboard with practiced economy. She opened a new file, a formal report. The form was standard, but her input was anything but. She did not write of disrespect or hurt feelings. She wrote with the sterile precision of an after-action report. Subject, breach of military conduct, Article 134, reporting officer, Commander Evelyn Reed. Subject of report, Brigadier General Marcus Thorne. Time, 14:32 Zulu. Location, Joint Operations Center, Forward Operating Base Archangel. Witnesses, see attached roster. Summary of events. At 14:32 Zulu, during an operational brief concerning anomalous electronic warfare signatures, Brigadier General Thorne disputed the assessment provided by the reporting officer. Following a brief verbal exchange, Brigadier General Thorne deliberately poured a glass of ice water onto the reporting officer in the presence of Operations Center staff. Verbatim quote from Brigadier General Thorne prior to action. "Let me cool you down, Commander. You seem a little overheated." Verbatim quote following action. There. Clarity. She paused, rereading the text. It was dry, factual, irrefutable. There was no mention of her own state, no interpretation of his motives. It was a simple declarative statement of fact. She attached the Operations Center watch bill, a list of over 20 names including Admiral Vance. She digitally signed the report with her common access card, the timestamp locking the submission to 14:48 Zulu, just 16 minutes after the incident. But here's what made it brilliant. She didn't route it to the base judge advocate. She didn't send it to the admiral's office. She sent it directly to a secure digital records repository, a quiet, unmonitored archive where it would exist as a permanent, verifiable entry. It was a digital flare, unseen for now, but ready to be illuminated when needed. Proof. Chain of custody. These were the foundations of correction. Report filed. She stood and walked out of the annex. Her uniform was still damp, a cold reminder of the public spectacle, but inside her system was calm. The first move had been made, not in anger, not in retaliation, in documentation. What happens when a man who's never been told no decides that words aren't enough? 3 days passed. Reed returned to her duties with the same quiet efficiency that had defined her entire career. She analyzed signals. She briefed junior analysts. She swam in the dive training facility before dawn, moving through the cold water with methodical grace. The base hummed with whispers. Stories spread like wildfire in military communities, and this one had all the elements of a good rumor. A general. A female officer, public humiliation. Some versions had her crying, some had her shouting back. None had the truth, which was that she had simply walked away and filed paperwork. Thorne, for his part, seemed to have forgotten the incident entirely, or perhaps he believed it was settled. He had reasserted his dominance. She had been put in her place. The natural order had been restored. But then came the corridor. It was late afternoon. Reed was walking from the intelligence center back to her quarters, her arms full of classified materials in a locked courier bag. The hallway was one of the older sections of the base, narrow and lined with storage lockers. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. She heard the boots before she saw him, heavy, deliberate. Thorne rounded the corner ahead of her, flanked by two of his staff officers. His face was flushed. There was something in his eyes. Something that went beyond professional disagreement. It was personal now. "Commander," he said, his voice loud enough to echo off the metal walls. Still chasing ghosts, his staff officers laughed. It was an ugly sound, forced, performative. Reed stopped walking. She maintained a respectful distance, her body language neutral. "General," she said evenly, "I'm en route to a secure briefing. Please excuse me." She moved to step around him. Thorne sidestepped, blocking her path. His bulk filled the narrow corridor. "You embarrass me in front of the Admiral," he said quietly. His voice was different now. Lower, more dangerous. "That signal you were so concerned about turned out to be nothing, just like I said." Reed's eyes flicked to the two staff officers behind him. They were watching, but something in their expressions was uncertain. They knew this had crossed a line. "General," she said, her voice calm but firm, "this is not the time or place for this discussion. I need you to step aside." Thorne's hand shot out. He grabbed her shoulder, his grip tight enough to hurt. "You need to learn some respect," he hissed. "You need to learn when to keep your mouth shut." And then something shifted in Reed's eyes. It wasn't anger, it wasn't fear, it was a calculation. A decision tree running through her mind at lightning speed. Assess threat level. Evaluate escape routes. Consider force options. She had been trained for this. Not in a classroom, not in a courtroom, in water so cold it could stop your heart, in darkness so complete you couldn't see your own hands. She moved. Her left hand came up, breaking his grip on her shoulder with a precise outward rotation. Her right hand, still holding the courier bag, swung low and then up, using the weight of the bag as a distraction. Thorne's eyes followed the bag. That was his mistake. Reed's left hand, now free, came across in a smooth arc. The edge of her palm connected with the nerve cluster just below his jaw. It was a strike taught in close quarters combat training. Precise. Controlled. Designed to disorient without causing permanent damage. Thorne's eyes rolled back. His knees buckled. He dropped like a sack of sand, his massive frame hitting the deck with a sound that echoed through the corridor. The two staff officers stared in shock. Reed stood over the general's unconscious form, her breathing steady, the courier bag still secure in her grip. She looked at the staff officers. Her voice, when it came, was utterly calm. "He grabbed me. I defended myself. You saw it." She stepped over Thorne's body and continued walking down the corridor, her boots making soft, measured sounds against the deck plating. Behind her, one of the staff officers was already calling for medical assistance, his voice high with panic. But here's what no one tells you about those moments. The moments when everything changes. There's no dramatic music, no slow motion. There's just you and a choice. Reed had made hers, not in that corridor. She had made it 20 years ago when she first put on the uniform. The choice to be excellent, the choice to be precise. The choice to never, ever compromise her standards, even when the people around her had none. She walked back to her quarters. She set the courier bag on her desk. She sat down at her personal terminal, and she wrote another report, same format, same sterile language, same attached witness list. She documented the second incident with the same cold precision she had used for the first. Then she encrypted it, filed it in the same secure repository, and went to take a shower. The water was hot this time. It washed away the tension. It washed away the echo of his hand on her shoulder. But it didn't wash away the knowledge of what was coming. Thorne would not let this stand. Men like him never did. How do you fight a system that was designed to protect men like him? Reed knew the answer. You don't fight the system. You use it. You become so precise, so documented, so irrefutable that the system has no choice but to work the way it was designed to work. By the next morning, Thorne had filed his own report. According to his version of events, Reed had attacked him without provocation in a narrow corridor. He claimed he was attempting to have a professional conversation when she became aggressive and violent. His two staff officers corroborated his story, their statements carbon copies of his own narrative. Within hours, the base was buzzing with a new rumor. Commander Reed had assaulted a general officer. She was going to be court-martialed. Her career was over. Some people shook their heads sadly. Such a waste. Some people nodded knowingly. They always knew there was something off about her. Too quiet. Too controlled, too cold. Reed was confined to quarters pending investigation. She was not allowed to access classified materials. She was not allowed to enter the operations center. She sat in her small room and waited, but she wasn't worried, because she knew something that Thorne didn't know. She knew that truth had a structure. It had a timestamp. It had a digital signature. It had witnesses who couldn't be intimidated because they were electrons, not people. The investigation was assigned to a Navy captain named David Calloway, a former surface warfare officer who now worked in the judge advocate's office. He was methodical and fair, with a reputation for following evidence rather than rank. He interviewed witnesses. He reviewed statements. And then he did something that Thorne hadn't anticipated. He checked the secure records repository. He found Reed's first report, the one filed 16 minutes after the water incident. He read her spare, factual summary. He noted the timestamp. He noted the witness list. Then he found her second report, the one filed the same night as the corridor incident, before Thorne had even regained consciousness, before any of his staff officers had given their statements. Calloway sat in his office, the two reports side by side on his screen. Then he made a phone call. "Admiral," he said when Vance answered, "we have a problem. Or rather, General Thorne has a problem." 3 days later, the formal inquiry began. It was held in a secure conference room. Present were Admiral Vance, Captain Calloway, a Marine Corps colonel serving as Thorne's advocate, and Commander Reed, still confined to quarters but allowed to attend her own hearing. Thorne sat at one end of the table, his face a mask of righteous indignation. His jaw was still slightly swollen where Reed had struck him. He had been practicing his speech. He was going to explain how this junior officer had threatened good order and discipline, how she had attacked a superior officer, how she represented everything wrong with allowing women into combat roles. He was ready. Admiral Vance looked at Calloway. "Captain, your findings." Calloway stood. He held a data slate. "Admiral, I've completed a thorough review of all statements and evidence related to both incidents involving Commander Reed and General Thorne. The investigation revealed several significant discrepancies." He tapped the slate. The screen on the wall behind him lit up. First, regarding the initial incident in the Joint Operations Center. Commander Reed filed a formal report 16 minutes after the event occurred. Her report was time-stamped and digitally signed. It includes verbatim quotes and a complete witness list. Thorne shifted in his seat. That report was insubordinate, he growled. She was filing a complaint instead of accepting correction. Calloway's expression didn't change. "General, the report was not a complaint. It was a statement of fact. It was filed in a secure repository, not sent to any command authority. It was documentation, not escalation." He tapped the slate again. "Second, regarding the corridor incident. Commander Reed filed a second report the same evening before you had filed your statement, before your staff officers had given their statements. Her report documents that you physically grabbed her shoulder and that she responded with a defensive strike." Thorne's face darkened. "That's a lie. I never touched her." "She attacked me." Calloway nodded slowly. "That's what your report claims. That's what your staff officers claim. But there's a problem with that, General." He tapped the slate one more time. The screen changed. It showed grainy security footage from the corridor. The angle was high and slightly obscured by a ventilation duct, but the image was clear enough. They watched as Thorne blocked Reed's path. They watched as his hand shot out and grabbed her shoulder. They watched as Reed broke his grip, distracted him with the courier bag, and delivered a single, precise strike to his jaw. They watched him collapse. They watched her step over his body and walk away without looking back. The room was silent. The footage was damning. It didn't show an attack, it showed self-defense. It showed a level of control and precision that was almost clinical. It showed a woman defending herself against a man twice her size who had initiated physical contact. But more than that, it showed restraint. She could have done more damage. She could have kicked him while he was down. She could have shouted, could have made a scene. Instead, she had removed the threat with the minimum necessary force, and then simply left. That, Admiral Vance said into the stunned silence, is what credibility looks like. It is the alignment of fact with testimony. He turned to Calloway. Is there anything else? Yes, Admiral. Calloway pulled up Reed's first report on the screen again. This was submitted to the Secure Records Archive by Commander Reed 2 days before the incident in the corridor. The date and timestamp were clear. The dry, factual account of Thorne pouring water on her, complete with verbatim quotes, was displayed in stark black and white text. Vance let the implications sink in. She documented the first incident before the second one even happened, he said quietly. She established a pattern of behavior. She created a chain of custody for his misconduct. She did not escalate. She did not complain. She documented. Then, when physically threatened, she responded with a degree of force so precisely calibrated as to be a work of art. She protected herself while ensuring he was not seriously injured. She did everything right. The Marine colonel looked from the screen to the Admiral. Sir, this changes the entire scope of the investigation. No, Colonel, Vance corrected him gently. It doesn't change the scope, it concludes it. You now have your evidence. I expect your final report on my desk by 1800 hours. A report that reflects the truth shown on that screen, not the story told by a man whose ego rights checks his body can't cash. Thorne stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is outrageous, he sputtered. She humiliated me in front of my men. She assaulted a general officer. You're going to take her word over mine? Vance stood as well. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of 30 years of command. General Thorne, I am not taking her word. I am taking the evidence. The video evidence. The documented evidence. The time-stamped, digitally signed, irrefutable evidence. You had the opportunity to tell the truth. You chose instead to lie and to encourage your subordinates to lie with you. That is a failure not just of character, but of leadership. You are dismissed. Why does dignity require no defense, no explanation, no raised voice? The formal hearing was convened not as a court-martial for Commander Reed, but as non-judicial punishment for Brigadier General Marcus Thorne. The venue was the main briefing theater, the same room where larger strategic decisions were made. It was packed. Admiral Vance had made attendance mandatory for all officers, senior and junior, from every branch of service on the base. He wanted this to be a lesson. Reed sat at a small table to one side, dressed in immaculate service dress whites. She was accompanied by a legal officer who had barely spoken to her. Her evidence had done all the talking. Thorne sat at another table, his face a thunderous mask of indignation. His 2 staff officers sat behind him, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Admiral Vance presided. He did not waste time with theatrics. We are here to address a profound failure of leadership and character, he began, his voice filling the silent room. For several days, this base has been consumed by rumors and false narratives surrounding an incident between 2 officers. We will now deal in facts. He had the security footage from the corridor played on the main screen for all to see. The room was utterly silent as they watched the fluid, shocking takedown. They saw Thorne's aggression and Reed's calm, controlled response. Then Vance had Reed's first report displayed, the one about the water incident. He read her sparse, factual summary aloud. He let the words hang in the air. Brigadier General Thorne, Vance said, his eyes locking onto the man. You were presented with a tactical assessment from a subject matter expert. You disagreed. Instead of engaging with the data, you chose to humiliate the officer who presented it. You then compounded this failure by physically intimidating and ultimately assaulting that same officer days later. When your assault failed, you and your subordinates conspired to file false official statements to destroy her career. At every step, you chose ego over duty, arrogance over honor. You have disgraced your uniform, and you have failed every Marine under your command. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. You are hereby found guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer, of assault, and of making a false official statement. You are relieved of your command, effective immediately. You will receive a formal letter of reprimand that will be placed in your permanent file, effectively ending your career. You will be reassigned to a staff position pending your mandatory retirement. Your staff officers will face their own disciplinary action for their complicity. He then turned his attention to the assembled crowd. Let this be a lesson to every single person in this room. Competence is not determined by volume. Strength is not demonstrated by bluster. And restraint is not a sign of weakness. It is the highest form of discipline. Commander Reed acted with a level of professionalism and control under extreme provocation that should be the standard for every one of us. He looked directly at Reed. Commander, you are fully exonerated and restored to your duties. Your analysis regarding the electronic warfare signatures in Grid Square 79er, the one that started this whole affair, proved to be accurate. A special operations team acting on your initial assessment located and neutralized a mobile missile battery preparing to engage a carrier strike group. Your analysis saved lives. Your conduct has provided a necessary course correction for the culture of this command. He then stood up, a clear signal that the hearing was over. As the room began to stir, a remarkable thing happened. A young Marine lieutenant, one who had been in the operations center during the initial incident, stood up. He turned to face Reed, came to attention, and rendered a slow, perfect salute. Then another officer did the same, and another. Soon every officer in the room, sailors and Marines alike, was on their feet saluting her. It was a silent, powerful apology, a spontaneous ritual of respect. Reed stood, her face betraying no emotion, and returned a single crisp salute to the room. She held it for a moment, then dropped her hand, turned, and walked out. Later that evening, she was back in the dive training facility. She was not in the water this time, but meticulously cleaning and inspecting a closed-circuit rebreather, her hands moving with familiar grace. Master Chief Elias Kane worked beside her in comfortable silence. He reached into a locker and pulled out a small embroidered patch. He slid it across the workbench to her. It was a black circle. In the center was a stylized phoenix, its wings spread wide, rendered in silver and gold thread. Around the bird were the words, "Faith amidst the static." The Admiral thought your old one was a bit outdated, the Master Chief rumbled, not looking at her. Figured this one was more accurate. Reed picked up the patch. She ran her thumb over the intricate stitching of the phoenix, the emblem of rebirth from ashes. It was a token, a quiet recognition of what she had endured and how she had prevailed. It was a sign that the system, for all its flaws, could sometimes correct itself. She nodded once, a gesture of thanks deeper than any words, and slipped the patch into her pocket. The restoration was complete. The door to the facility hissed open and Captain Calloway entered. He held a data slate. He walked over to the workbench, his expression one of quiet respect. "Evelyn," he said, "new tasking from Fleet Cyber Command." Reed looked up from her work, her eyes already focused on the next mission. The events of the past week were now just a closed file, a data point in a long career. The room felt quieter now. The base culture had subtly but permanently shifted. The loud, corrosive static of Thorne's command style had been filtered out, replaced by a clearer signal. She took the slate from Calloway, her gaze already scanning the preliminary intelligence. "Understood." He hesitated for a moment, then said quietly, "What you did. It mattered for everyone." Reed's eyes didn't leave the screen. She absorbed the new data, the new problem, the next equation that needed solving. She placed her hand on the new patch in her pocket, the phoenix emblem, a small solid weight against her palm. The past was archived. The future was loading. And in that moment she understood something that had taken 2 decades to fully crystallize. Power is not volume, strength is not spectacle, true authority doesn't announce itself. It simply exists, quiet and absolute, waiting for the moment when proof is required. And when that moment comes, it doesn't argue, it doesn't defend, it doesn't raise its voice. It presents the facts, it shows the receipts, it lets the truth do what truth always does when given the chance. It corrects. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Sometimes justice doesn't shout. It documents. Sometimes strength doesn't push back. It stands still and lets the world reveal itself for what it is. Reed had learned this truth not in a classroom or from a manual, but from the cold water of 1,000 training divees. From the silent darkness where panic is a death sentence and calm is the only currency that matters. She had learned that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the smartest. That the person who makes the biggest scene is usually compensating for the smallest competence. That real power lies not in domination but in precision. Not in force but in fact. She had been dismissed, humiliated, assaulted, and lied about. And she had responded not with anger but with documentation. Not with revenge but with process. Not with volume but with silence so loud it echoed through the halls of power until no one could ignore it anymore. Correction achieved, she said softly. The words were not a boast. They were a simple statement of completion, a mission accomplished, a system restored. The Master Chief looked at her and smiled slightly. That it is, Commander, that it is. And in the quiet hum of that training facility, surrounded by the tools of her trade and the respect of those who truly understood what she had done, Evelyn Reed returned to her work, because there were still signals to track, still threats to analyze. Still missions that required someone who could see the whisper before the scream. Someone who understood that the most dangerous threats are often the quietest ones. And someone who knew, beyond any doubt, that dignity doesn't need a defense. It just needs the truth. And the patience to let that truth do its work. Sometimes, dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.